Hey, David Koresh, why'd you buy so many handguns? We're the Armed Attorneys. Today we're talking about a now viral video of the ATF harassing law-abiding gun owner, the law that applies in this scenario, kind of our perspective on it, how it applies to the Fourth Amendment, and some best practices if you should find yourself in this situation. But before we begin, show your support for the Second Amendment by hitting that like button. And to start things off, what are we talking about, Edwin?
Well, we're talking about the incident that I'm sure most people have seen where a couple of armed ATF agents who were dressed out in body armor, including they had brought along a member of the Delaware State Police with them to go up to a man's house. This was all caught in his Ring doorbell, and have an interaction with him about multiple gun purchases that he had made. One of the more alarming aspects of this was the fact that the ATF had a whole stack of papers that they already had on this guy. Plus, they brought along a Delaware State police officer for some reason. There's no indication on what Delaware state laws were implicated in this, but yet they felt the need to bring this guy along. And it had a real big brotherish feel to the whole thing. Like they knew everything this guy had done before they even asked him the first question.
And that's got to be linked down in the description below. But what we're talking about here is the law 18 U.S.C. 932. Now, there's a provision there that says, you know, the sale of multiple handguns or revolvers and pistols in a 5-day period, whether they do it at the same time or it's spread out over 5 days. The federal firearms license dealer, the FFL, the gun store in that scenario, has to notify the ATF, has to notify local law enforcement. Now, after Operation Fast and Furious, when there doesn't appear to be any statutory authority for this, but they expanded this to the sale of certain kind of AR-style platform firearms, you know, that are sold in southwest border states, firearms that have, you know, detachable magazines, caliber 223, 5.56, that kind of deal. So we see something similar with long guns in this regard. Now, let's talk about the ATF tactics on this, because, I mean, I see the legitimate law enforcement interests of, you know, and this is what we're looking at was whether this was a straw purchase. And so what are we talking about when we say straw purchase?
Well, they're investigating to see if he basically had bought these firearms, these pistols, in order to transfer them to somebody else, perhaps somebody who was not allowed to buy them. Of course, we know that with regard to the law of straw purchases, that the use of another person's money is fundamental to that. I don't know how they were going to eventually get to that. The whole thing was pretty much just a fishing expedition. And, you know, everybody should remember that they do have the right not to answer questions. And they're not required to answer the door whenever the ATF comes knocking. So it would have been interesting to see if he would have taken that tactic.
Yeah, and I think a question that we've heard from, you know, clients and folks is, you know, can the ATF come and visit me at my house? And the answer to that is yes. So it comes down to, you know, the police are allowed to, it's called a voluntary encounter at that point, and that's what we saw in the video. They can come up, knock on your door, chat you up, depending on the information that they receive based on that interaction. Maybe they have enough information that would lead them to a warrant, but to come up, knock on someone's door, yes. I mean, it seems like they're being a little intimidating, especially the way they came, you know, bodied, armored up and in numbers. But, you know, that would have been characterized as a voluntary transaction. As a reminder, voluntary transaction, that means that you're free to go. Unless they have some kind of reasonable suspicion that you committed a crime, unless they have probable cause that you committed a crime, or unless they have a search warrant, it kind of ends there. But when you're talking to clients, Edwin, and you see this kind of Fourth Amendment implication here, absent a warrant, you know, how are the police getting into somebody's house, searching their firearms collection, or what are you talking about?
Well, that's what's very interesting about this was the stack of papers that the ATF agent had. The one important piece of paper that he did not have with him was a signed warrant. And that's probably because they had no evidence that this man had, in fact, committed any kind of crime. They're just there on a fishing expedition to see if they could try to find additional information that could perhaps allow them to charge him with a crime. And so it would have been very interesting to see if he would have just cut them off and said, sorry, not answering questions, shut the door on them. Perhaps I believe that their response may have been something along the lines of, hey, buddy, you ever heard of a place called Waco? I think you know how this is going to turn out. So we may have seen that, but he would have been perfectly within his rights to do that. And when somebody does call with that kind of issue. Hey, the ATF are at my door. They want information. There's a lot of other circumstances that we have to find out before giving the most practical advice. There are those folks who say, I don't want to comply at all. I'm only going to comply with what I'm legally required to do, in which those people are going to shut the door and not say a word. But as a practical matter, somebody who maybe is perhaps involved in other activities that the police would find evidence of, you do not want to let those officers into your house. Whereas if this had been a little old man, retired police officer, bought his and her guns for his wife's anniversary, perhaps there's no issue with regard to him showing them the guns, and they go away and they don't bother him again. So every situation really, really is fact dependent.
Yeah, and it's going to depend on your state's law, and only an attorney licensed in your state will be able to tell you what to do based on your particular circumstances. But absent a warrant of arrest or search, the police, they can't just go barging into your house. But one of the biggest exceptions to the warrant requirement under the Fourth Amendment is consent. So how do folks manifest consent? Oh, sure, come on in. Or, yeah, let me, I'll talk to you. Or here are the guns, That's the kind of stuff that manifests, hey, this is voluntary. And the courts have said, hey, voluntary, you can waive whatever rights you want. And waiving your right to be free from searches and seizures, that would have been upheld. Now, again, going back to what Edwin was saying, if you're an absent a warrant, absent consent, depending who you are, these all could look like different scenarios.
Well, one of the things that we often see in these types of encounters is, and I guess this comes from ATF experience, is the ATF agent always seems to emphasize the fact that the guns can be brought to them on the front porch. So at least they're not, saying we need to come in, we need to actually sit at your kitchen table, look around your house to see what other things you have. So they are saying we only want to come to your porch. Now, one of the possibilities that they had that Delaware state agent is, and obviously we are not intimately familiar with the laws of the state of Delaware, but let's say that the individual had wanted to abruptly end conversation, not interact with the officers. Many states have a law that makes it illegal to interfere, and I'm using my air quotes there, interfere with a police officer engaging in his duty. And so perhaps the Delaware state police officer was there to intimidate the citizen by kind of, making him aware that, look, I'm here to make sure you don't violate that law and you let these guys do what they want.
And, we can only speculate, like Edwin said, but the question that we got coming out of this over and over was, hey, could my refusal to allow them to inspect my firearm collection, would that be enough to get a search warrant under these circumstances? And I think probably not. This multiple sale firearm report that goes to the ATF, that goes to local police, that's an important data point. But absent some other piece of information, I don't know that that is enough reliable information that a police officer could say, hey, this person is more likely than not is in the process or is about to commit a crime. Now, if one of those firearms that was purchased shows up at a crime scene, or maybe even multiple of firearms that were purchased in a short period of time showed up at multiple crime scenes, well, then you might have a little bit of a different story. But that kind of brings us to our discussion of what are some best practices when interacting with law enforcement. It's important that you understand your rights. You have a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. You have a right to remain silent. And you also have a right to have effective assistance of counsel, to have an attorney. And that is usually the best scenario that you need to take advantage of. Before interacting with law enforcement, it's always a best practice to speak to an attorney licensed in your state, because they can advise you on your particular circumstances. But absent that, not consenting to searches, not consenting to seizures, speaking to your attorney, what else do you tell your clients, Edwin?
Well, if you do choose to invoke these rights, don't allow yourself to be intimidated by the police into giving them up. Because once you give them up, once you give consent, whatever they do after that is generally going to be viewed by the courts as being acceptable.
We have some important videos linked in the description below about interacting with law enforcement and some of the most common reasons we see the ATF coming to folks' doors. Make sure to check out those videos. But we hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and help us fight the anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video. And we always enjoy your questions and comments in the section below. And until next time, we're the Armed Attorneys.